So I was asked by James to present the Indo-Caribbean experience and story as in favor to why I choose to believe that reparations are due by Britain to the Caribbean, specifically in Guyana, and mainly a lot of other Caribbean nations. Now, it's very easy to look at the question of reparations and you have so many figures, you have stats, you have things that countries have gone through. But as an Indo-Caribbean woman who was a product of Guyanese parents who was raised their whole life in Guyana, they were colonized by the British, yet their ancestors can be traced in India. And I was raised in New York City. It's a little bit of a various mix. And it's the best way you can look at it is through experience. So I was first generation born in my family in America. And I was lucky enough to be born in an area of New York City where it was predominantly West Indian and Caribbean. So I always went to schools where people knew about my culture and I learned about other people's culture. And growing up, my mom and my parents, especially my mom, was always like, you are a colored woman growing up in America. So the whole time I'm just like, my mom was just saying that because she wants to make sure we're okay, we understand things. But I did not understand what that meant to be a minority until I went into college. And I went to a private institution in New York City, in Queens, the most diverse borough in the entire city, and I was still considered a minority. And then when I say that I'm West Indian, I have Indian colleagues and classmates who said I'm not Indian enough because I'm from West Indies. And because my ancestors were taken from the motherland, taken from India, ended up being tainted because of how our Indian culture was translated in the Caribbean. Now, that very much crossed me as very rude, and I was very taken back because I've always considered myself West Indian. I understood that there was a difference between East Indians and West Indians, but then why is it considered that I'm not Indian enough to other Indians? When culturally, even though granted my family, we were raised Christian, there are many Indo-Caribbeans who practice Hinduism, who practice Islam, but yet we're still not considered Indian enough. Yes, I don't personally know Hindi, but I know that my grandfather studied Hindi, studied Urdu, but that still did not make him Indian enough because he was born and raised in Guyana. But that, again, sparked my interest in studying into British Empire and how exactly that translates into my life. Growing up, I always studied world history. I would learn about the history of the African continent. I would learn about the Indian history. And we learn in American education through advanced placement world history about British colonialism. It was briefly talked about in our regular American history as to how it was called, how Britain colonized America, but it didn't go into the British Empire colonial powers and its colonial events, except until you go into advanced history, which again, that's another conversation for another time. But that's how I learned about it. And then still within that narrative, no one spoke about the Caribbean. No one spoke about the British Empire's actions within the Caribbean, but I knew that Britain colonized many aspects of the Caribbean, as well as France, Portugal, and other European powers. But that was not spoken about. And so within that narrative, I conducted my own research. And there is so much that even within the Caribbean nations, you still see the effects of how colonialism has affected the way just simply people think. For example, you would be in the Caribbean, you have profound academics who would teach at the University of West Indies, the most prominent university system within the region. And yet, unless they hold a degree from America or from a European power, especially when it's looked highly upon when you get it from England or France or Germany or places like this, you're not considered qualified enough to teach at that university. When you're growing up, I have my cousin-in-law. She recently came, she married my cousin and she recently came to America. She was telling me when she's in school they are told that they should take the SATs, they should take certain tests because it'll look more favorable to them when they apply to schools in America or in England or in France. There is systematically a brain drain within the region when you are taking away the academics, the intelligence within a nation. How do you expect that region to prosper? And again, you can trace all of that back to how colonialism, the British Empire, affected it. You have people who, there was a whole hierarchy set where you have the Europeans, then you have when you have the indentured servants, which was how the Indians were brought over. We were brought over as indentured servants, and then you have the slaves, where the Afro-Caribbeans, the Africans, were brought over. Then once the Europeans left, there was a power vacuum. So then you have immense fighting between the ethnicities that were left. So you have the Indians, you have the Afro-Caribbeans, but you also have the native indigenous population. So we also, sometimes we call it Buck people, but they're indigenous people in the region. And they were all vying for that power, that system that was left, that vacuum that was left from the British. Today in Guyana, you have the political parties based on race. And yet it's that mindset, that idea that certain races are superior than the other, which can be traced back to the British Empire. Now with the formulation of the United Nations and also CARICOM, which is the Organization of Caribbean Nations, there was formed a committee known as the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Their main goal is to establish the moral, ethical, and legal case for the payment of reparations by the governments of Great Britain, of the Netherlands, of France, of Spain, Portugal, Norway, and Sweden. And most recently, I also heard about Germany now too. They all sent this great letters, this demand of payment letter to all of these nations. By right, the nation that was most responsive to this letter was the nation of Great Britain. Britain then ended up responding by investing within the Caribbean region, and especially in countries like Jamaica, Guyana, and Trinidad, the largest countries that they had colonized, as well as some regions, Barbados, but it's primarily in those three countries. According to the New York Times, Britain invested roughly 300 million pounds into the United Kingdom Caribbean Infrastructure Partnership, which is basically a partnership that creates buildings and infrastructures within the Caribbean regions. Additionally, they also focused on fighting crime within the Caribbean region. Now, some may argue that at the same time, that's something that helps out the British people as well, because there are so many Caribbean individuals living in the region of Great Britain and the UK as a whole, that when they are criminalized and when they're put into the British penal system, they are then deported back to their home country, whether it is Guyana, whether it is Trinidad, whether it is Jamaica. Currently, there are over 1,000 Caribbean nationals within the British penal system. Once they are in this penal system, they are then shipped back. So what the British government decided to do was push money and as an aspect to be like, we are fighting crime within the region. But they are doing this by building prisons that they are sending these same Caribbean nationals that are within their borders back to what they consider their home country. But how is that helping the Caribbean region? That is just instead putting criminals back into that region. And scholars argue these criminals have not perpetrated the crime on Caribbean soil. They tend to be people who have grown up in Britain and then they are shipped back to Guyana, but they don't have any actual roots in Guyana. All their family is in Britain and now America. So what are they doing there? There is no reason for them to be there. All of this wraps up into why Britain should still be paying reparations. You have whole generations not understanding their roots. They don't understand where they came from. They have such a disconnect between Guyana, from Trinidad, from Barbados, from Jamaica, because they are raised within these systems that are not even taught. Because you're simply in schools, you're not taught about colonial history of how deep it ran. And there was a whole article about how you can tell and you can talk about the history of Great Britain and simply mention colonialism. but you cannot speak about the history of Guyana. You cannot speak about the history of Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, India, Africa without speaking about colonialism. That is impossible, and you will never get away from that narrative. And within all of this, this is why Britain should be paying reparations, because of just how much they have robbed culturally, mentally, and even physically from those regions and those nations.